I see some clients, they go to the Western medicine doctor and they have a more traditional Western medicine approach to blood work. So I'd love if you could share what the differences are when it comes to blood work from a functional medicine perspective and a Western medicine perspective.
Well, Shadia, thank you for coming on. I thought this would be really helpful for everyone to go over your labs because you had reached out to me saying that there might be some hints of insulin resistance with your labs, and I'll share some screenshots as we go through this. But you got a really nice panel from LabCorp, which I strongly suggest most people do at least once a year, and if they're dealing with an active health issue, perhaps twice a year. What inspired you to get labs?
Well, I think for me, I'm in the functional nutrition space, and I think I'm always going to be interested in learning what's new and what's happening with my health. But I think right now, I was recently diagnosed with adenomyosis. And later on, I found out there was beginning stages of endometriosis. So after I found that out, I realized, okay, let's just dive into it and learn what's going on with my health and go a few layers deeper and do I was running all the testing, the gut health testing, blood work, and hormone testing as well. So really excited to see what we go over today. I think it's gonna be great.
No, I would love to do that a little bit more. And just for listeners, you're a health coach and you work with clients and things like that. Do you want to give just a little bit of context before we dive into the labs?
Yes, I've been working in the functional medicine space. I started in functional nutrition, and in my previous life, I was in the fitness industry. So that was really the biggest thing for me, just fitness and wellness. And then I moved to functional nutrition about 5 years ago. And now I decided to specialize in gut health. So this is the reason why we're here today.
Heck yeah, I love it. Well, speaking of gut health, a lot of people now know that gut health is linked with metabolic health, thanks to Ozempic and all the different drugs that affect gut hormones. So that's a nice segue into the first area that I love to look at, Shadia, is metabolic health. And that was one of the things that you were concerned about too, is, hey, does my blood sugar related biomarkers, triglycerides, lipid panel, all of that, what does that indicate or reflect about my metabolic health? So let's go through that. So the first thing, obviously, we like to look at is under the lipids and glucose, and that is your glucose, your hemoglobin A1C. And again, I look at all of those in the context, and I'll just offer a disclaimer. I'm not a doctor. I have been reviewing labs and working with healthcare practitioners since 2006. And so I've been trained by many medical doctors and worked in collaboration with them, with clients that I've worked with since 2006. And this is just what my mentors have taught me, is to look at your glucose, hemoglobin A1C, insulin, along with your triglycerides, lipids, Apo B, Apo A1 ratio, LDL, et cetera, along with liver function tests, which I will explain. And as folks can see on the screen here, we're going to go down to your glucose, which is great. And let me just ask you, Shadia, were you fasting or non-fasting?
I was fasting, yeah.
Okay, you're fasting. So your glucose was 95 milligrams per deciliter. Now, in an ideal world, your fasting glucose, Shadia, would be closer to 80. But the reality is when we drive to a clinic, whether it's an offsite LabCorp center or we go to our doctor's office, there's a little bit of stress and anxiety around venipuncture and you want to get there on time and that. So it's totally normal to have a fasting glucose. What I found, again, in my clinical experience, in the 90s, even when people have a strong trend towards optimal metabolic health, just because there's some angst around getting venipuncture. So your glucose was 95 in an ideal world. And again, this is where the at-home glucometers, I think, are a little bit better for just looking at glucose, because you can wake up first thing in the morning and test your glucose without the stress of driving to the clinic and giving them your ID and insurance cards and sitting there waiting, knowing you're going to get punctured with an 18 gauge needle to get your blood drawn, right? So I'll just tell you, closer to 80 is better. But the reason why I'm not totally concerned about that is your hemoglobin A1C, which reflects your 90-day average glucose levels, was 5.2, which is pretty good. Prediabetes starts at 5.7 and higher. So you're doing good there. And I will just,
What would be the optimal range for that purpose?
yeah, closer to, around 5, 4.8. But here's the thing about the hemoglobin A1C that we don't often talk about is everyone's degree of red blood cell breakdown varies a little bit. And so it's actually not, it's a pretty good approximation for your 90-day glucose average, but it's not perfect because it really depends upon, as I mentioned, some people break down their red blood cells a little bit faster. Some people are a little bit slower. So on average, there's that 90-day reflection of your average blood glucose. But we want to look at this in conjunction with everything else. And so, yeah, around mine, just so you know, Shadia, is 5.2 as well. And that's where, most people are hovering. If they exercise, eat a whole foods omnivorous style diet, don't consume a lot of processed wheats and sugars and things like that, it's between 4.8 and 5.2 is pretty average, I would say. So going down, again, the reason why we like to look at the lipids in conjunction with the glucose and the hemoglobin A1C is because as we start to become more insulin resistant from being sedentary, eating processed foods, one of the first biomarkers to increase is actually our triglycerides. And what's nice about yours, and I see this in people who have a history of being athletic, in your case, that is true, your triglycerides are 36 milligrams per deciliter, which is great. Anything under 60 is optimal. And so this really reflects to me that you have the ability you're more metabolically flexible and pivot between fats and glucose for your primary fuel substrates. Now, today's blood work review is brought to you by Myoscience. If you're looking for a way to optimize and support your sleep as well as metabolic health and healthy hydration, you should know about the MyRelax and Calm powdered drink mix. What makes this formula very unique from many of the other magnesium supplements out there is it not only features the electrolytes like magnesium in a glycinate form that's more bioavailable than the citrate and oxides that are out there, but you get potassium as well as L-theanine and glycine, which, as you may know, help induce a calm, relaxing mood and optimize sleep. But even more, the MyRelax and Calm also features taurine and myo-inositol. These are nutrients that, as you might know, are known to help support metabolic health. So this combination drink that tastes phenomenal, it's sweetened with stevia. It's recommended that you consume this in the 30 minutes prior to your desired sleep time. So you can check out the many reviews over at myoscience.com from people just like you who are noticing improvements in their sleep duration and sleep quality after using this formulation. You can save using the code podcast over at myoscience.com. So let's cut back to it with Shadia. And so what we see, Shadia and everyone else, is when people become more sedentary, eat more processed food, they have circadian rhythm disruption, a lot of stress, etc. Triglycerides are one of the first biomarkers to actually start to increase, even often before glucose and hemoglobin A1C. So when I look at that in conjunction with your high HDL, high density lipoprotein, that ratio's more than 2-to-1. Your ratio of HDL to triglycerides is about 2-to-1. So that's great. And so that's one of the things that there's pretty good evidence to suggest that as the ratio of your triglycerides to HDL become 1-to-1, that's when we start to see more metabolic health issues. And so, when we look at that along with your low VLDL cholesterol is just 8 in a fasted state, that's great. So in my opinion, no evidence or hints that there's underlying insulin resistance, which is really good. We can go on down since thankfully you ran your Apo B to Apo A1 ratio, which is phenomenal. And by the way, Shadia, did anyone tell you to run Apo B or did you just want to do this?
This is the normal panel I run. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. So most people know that your so-called atherogenic lipoproteins like VLDL, LDL, remnant lipoproteins, they all have precisely one apolipoprotein B on them. It's an exterior signaling protein, if you will. And your Apo B is just 69 milligrams per deciliter. Your Apo A1, which your HDL particles, the so-called lipoprotein particles involved in reverse cholesterol transport and anti-inflammatory properties in the body, are 171 milligrams per deciliter. So you're at a 2-to-1 ratio. When the Apo B and Apo A1 start to be closer to 1, that's when people are more concerned about the process of atherosclerosis or heart disease risk, and you're skewed in the favorable direction. Again, my bias, I'm very much a fan of exercise and healthy whole foods. This is precisely the pattern that we usually see in people who have been physically active for a while. So again, all of these cluster of related biomarkers all suggest that metabolic health is great. In fact, your ratio of Apo B to A1 is 0.4. As I mentioned, as it gets closer to 1, some people might be a little bit more concerned about the risk of cardiovascular disease, especially if individuals have a first-degree relative. So that is really good. No concerns there. And then the last thing that I like to look at to sort of check the box of this metabolic health bucket is your liver enzymes. And so if we go to the comprehensive metabolic panel here, there's 14 biomarkers in this cluster. We see AST, ALT, and then further down on page 3, I believe, is GGT. So as you know, Shadia, these are the 3 liver function tests. They represent, among other things, how much fat has been accumulated in the liver. And based upon your other biomarkers, we would suspect that they would be quite low, which they are. AST is 15, ALT is 12, and GGT is further down the list. I think I remember that was like 13 or 14. Let me just quickly go here. Yeah, it's 13 GGT. And so what's interesting about these liver function tests, particularly GGT, is it reflects glutathione status in the body. So the acronym GGT stands for gamma glutamyl transpeptidase. And essentially what that means is it's involved in the synthesis of glutathione, in getting the glutathione rate limiting amino acids inside your cells to make this glutathione tripeptide, which many people know you need an acetylcysteine, you need glycine and glutamine. So this enzyme is involved in getting these amino acids into your cells to make glutathione. And so when people have a diet enriched in processed foods or an occupational exposure to, say, environmental chemicals, maybe they work at a hair salon or a aluminum smelter plant or whatever, the demand for glutathione increases. And so we see this liver enzyme start to increase. And yours at 13 suggests that you probably go in the sauna, you probably don't have a lot of these parabens and phthalates and things in your diet or cosmetic products, which is great. So that's it for the one more thing. Do you have any questions before we move on?
I'd love to learn a little bit about that, because you're saying, okay, there's not a lot of toxins in your body based on your blood work, but I do get a lot of allergies when I do use certain products. And I try to stay really natural when it comes to my makeup, my hair, like all of those products. I'm aware of how impactful they can be.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if there is a specific way to kind of prevent allergies for women that are having similar reactions and also having decent blood work, right?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so unfortunately, GGT is just one of many ways that we can sort of triangulate one's total body accumulation or exposure to these persistent organic pollutants and endocrine disruptors and toxins, if you will, broadly speaking. There's another organic acid biomarker, which I'm sure you're familiar with, known as 8-OH-DG. And this reflects DNA damage from, say, cigarette smoking or arsenic or lead or things like that. So there's other things that we can look at on organic acids, for example, that might be a little bit more specific to look at total body burden of these compounds. GGT is just a more commercially available way that can give us a little bit of insight, but it's not going to reflect everything, right? So if you suspect that, I'm really sensitive to these things because, genetic susceptibility or whatever it may be, that's not necessarily the best, but it's one tool to look at. So in your case, Genova and they acquired Metametrics. They have a urinary perforin profile, I believe, and then some other profiles that you can look at to get a little bit more granular to see if, for example, do you have heavy metals, lead, mercury, things like that? Or is there actual DNA damage occurring? If the 8-OH-DG in your urine increases, well, that would suggest that there's something causing some DNA damage. And usually that would be more on the heavy metal side. That's not something that I generally look at or work with, but there is more tools out there for sure.
All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah. But GGT is just like a simple, non-invasive way, because this panel probably, I don't know if you pay cash or not, but we're looking at most $250. I mean, did you go through insurance or did you pay?
No, I do it by myself. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's cheap, right? So this is just a great way to get a general idea. But the reason why we look at these liver tests is not just for the heavy metals and things like that.
Right.
It's because when the liver starts to be filled up with fat, because the process of insulin resistance is settling in, again, because of circadian rhythm disruption, sleep issues, processed food consumption, sedentary activity, and things like that, the liver starts to build up with fat first. And even in people who have normal glucose and hemoglobin A1C, the liver starts to take the brunt of the insinuating metabolic health problems. And so that's what we see first. And then we see the triglycerides start to increase as well. And so again, when we're looking at this, because most people have some metabolic health issue, and because the liver is such a key organ regulating metabolic health, when the liver enzymes are quite low, then we don't generally suspect that. Now, I'm not sure if I see insulin. Oh, and we do have insulin. Okay, so fasting insulin 9.6. So pretty good, Shadia. Generally, and anything under 10, fasting is, I think, good. We see this hover between 4 and 7, in most people. As you likely know, there's really no need for an elevated fasting insulin. So insulin is a post-meal hormone that helps regulate blood sugar and get the amino acids from your meal into your muscles and so on. And so it really don't need high fasting insulin. And that's why it's good to look at in the context of metabolic health. So this would be just something to kind of pay attention to as well. But 9.6, not concerned about that. Now, especially because near the insulin, we see C-reactive protein, and yours was 0.35, which is great. We want to see that under 1. Now, sometimes people go get their labs and their CRP is like 0.6. And the last time they ran their labs, it was 0.2, let's just say, or 0.35. That can be a source of concern for some people. They're like, why is my CRP elevated? This transiently increases. It could be that you had a little seasonal cold that you weren't aware of or didn't remember because you were asymptomatic, for example. So this fluctuates a little bit. Generally, if it's under 1, no indication of chronic inflammation or chronic disease or things like that. So that's good that yours is 0.35. If there's not any questions, I do just want to highlight something that is really cool here. You also ran your serum coenzyme Q10, which is nice. And that was 1.09. So that's great. So either you're having some organs or possibly supplementing with coenzyme Q10, but that's good, of course, for mitochondrial health, energy production, as well as endurance, athletic capacity and things.
I was doing as I think I mentioned to you before, that I worked on my egg retrieval about a few months ago. Okay. So one of the recommendations was to increase the supplementation of the CoQ10. So that's where you're seeing that. Obviously, I'm eating organ meat as well, as you know, but this is something that's mostly probably coming from that supplementation.
Nice. And how much are you taking? Like 100 milligrams or more?
100 milligrams. No, I'm actually taking 200 milligrams. So I take 100 in the morning and 100 in the evening.
Nice. And do you remember how long you started taking that prior to getting these labs?
About a month. Before.
Okay.
So daily for about a month. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's one that could take a little bit longer to increase. It's fat soluble and it needs to build up and things like that. But I think that's awesome that you're taking coenzyme Q10. A lot of people don't even know what their coenzyme Q10 level is and don't consider supplementation. And what's unique about the organ meat aspect that you mentioned, it's an interesting story. Coenzyme Q10 used to be derived from beef heart. And so the first supplemental source of coenzyme Q10 was just a beef heart extract. And this was sold for a lot of years until there was microbial fermentation and the ability to extract this from microbes. But yeah, I think organ meats is great. And so if people don't eat heart occasionally, I really think they're missing out on CoQ10 and should consider possibly supplementing, especially people who are taking either red yeast rice or statins, because we know that those compounds inhibit the biosynthesis of CoQ10. So great stuff. Let's see. Another metabolic parameter that we look at is known as lactate dehydrogenase, or LDH. And as you can all see here, this is actually right near the liver function test, GGT. And yours is right in the middle of the lab range. So that's great. What we see, again, just like we talked about, the fat building up, or sorry, the liver building up with fat, triglycerides increasing, liver enzymes increasing, LDH can increase, and that's not increased in this case. And so this is not the most sensitive biomarker for metabolic health, but it's just another thing to possibly consider. So that's good. Now, since we're on this page, I see homocysteine. Here's the thing about homocysteine, Shadia, is a lot of people put a lot of weight into homocysteine and think, oh my gosh, mine is 12 or 13. I am at risk for heart disease and things like that. The homocysteine does reflect B vitamin metabolism and methylation status, among other things. It's also related to glutathione metabolism. But here's the reality of it is this measurement is really tough to do logistically in a LabCorp or Quest setting. In order to get super accurate levels of homocysteine, the practitioner or the phlebotomist needs to put it on ice right away. And so I know a lot of people really care about their homocysteine and think, oh my gosh, mine's elevated. What does that mean? I might need to take B12 and folate. The truth is it's a really tough assay, and that is not often conveyed when we get our labs back. But that being said, yours is just 6 micromoles per liter on the low end. So that's a good thing. But again, and since you asked about detox earlier, homocysteine is in equilibrium with S-adenosyl homocysteine, which is related to glutathione metabolism. It's all in that pathway of making this really important detoxification and antioxidant molecule. And so high homocysteine can be a problem for people if they are trying to optimize their detox pathways. And so I often, if one does have really high homocysteine, although the assay is a little bit questionable, that would possibly indicate not just B vitamin support like B12 and folate, but also N-acetylcysteine support and supporting glutathione, because it turns out, again, homocysteine, and I don't want to lose people in the weeds of multisyllabic words, but homocysteine is in equilibrium with S-adenosyl homocysteine, and that can block the formation of that cysteine precursor to make glutathione. And so when it's high, then one does want to support both B vitamins and also sulfur in their diet in the form of, garlic, onions, eggs, obviously, but also supplement with N-acetylcysteine. Okay. There was one thing that was elevated, and I'm not super concerned about it, Shadia, but this was your iron saturation and iron binding capacity. I want to get into that, but did you have any questions?
I think that is the primary question. So I'll just go ahead and wait.
Yeah. So anytime something is high or low on your labs, whether it's phosphorus or lipids, whatever, and it says low or high, people get concerned, and we kind of get tunnel vision and think, oh my gosh, something is really wrong. And so I was looking at this, and then I also looked down. When we look at iron, total iron binding capacity, iron saturation, we also need to consider ferritin. So what, Shadia, I went to look at your ferritin, and it was right in kind of on the higher end that I see for most women, actually, who are not in menopause, and that is 89 nanograms per ml. So not super concerned about your iron binding capacity or being anemic. You could possibly, if you ever feel lightheaded when you stand up, for example, or during exercise, maybe have more iron containing foods like red meat or liver, things like that. But I don't see any sign of anemia. But that being said, you do start to see shifts in total iron binding capacity and iron saturation when people become anemic. So perhaps anemia is something that you might want to work on. And I would just ask you, have you ever been told by a doctor that you're anemic in the past?
Maybe as a child. I
Yeah.
think so. Maybe when I was, yeah,
Younger.
10, 12, something like that.
Yeah. I mean, it's common, for women. Um, and the inverse is true for men. Men tend to accumulate more iron over the course of their life, and women, especially before perimenopause and menopause, tend to be on the lower side because obviously menstruation, you're naturally bloodletting a little bit, if you will, and men don't ever bloodlet. And so that's why men in their mid 30s, I find, run on the opposite end of the spectrum and actually have tendencies towards iron overload. And so they should probably donate blood, especially if these biomarkers that I want to go through now are high. And that is your red blood cell, your hemoglobin, and your hematocrit. So, Shadia, these are all good. Your hemoglobin is like slightly below the midline, not concerning, just something to focus on, especially, with child planning and things like that. Your hematocrit is at 40%, which is great. Most women, this is where they struggle. And this is the hemoglobin, hematocrit, and iron, especially again in the premenopausal women, I should say. But all of these look pretty good to me. Although your RDW, your red blood cell distribution, or the width, it's on the smaller side. Again, it's barely, it's 1/10 of 1 unit off. Not super concerning, but just something to pay attention to. So in your case, an omnivorous diet, having liver periodically is going to serve you. So that's the take home there. The other thing that I did want to mention, so near that, Shadia, so we're looking, everyone, at the CBC with differential and platelet. And we see the MCV is a little bit on the high side. It's not high by the reference range at all, but it's over 92, And this is, the unit is not picograms. I can't remember what the unit stands for, but when we see the MCV over 92, a mentor of mine, Harry Eidnier, who did an analysis with Michigan State University, tens of thousands of people, they found that this is linked with increased need for folate and B12. And so for what it's worth, Shadia, you may benefit from just either a multivitamin periodically. As I mentioned, liver and organ meats would be helpful periodically, which you're doing, which is great. And possibly, if you don't want to do a multivitamin, just periodic use of B12 and folate.
Can we supplement with organ meat as well?
Yeah, I have no problem with that. From a high quality source, there's capsules. And is that what you're saying? Or are you talking about just eating organs?
Eating organs, yes, but I'm also asking, can we just take a supplement for people that don't really enjoy eating organ meat? I personally love it, but I know a lot of people that are against actually eating it.
Yeah, they don't like the mouthfeel or the flavor.
Yeah.
Totally get it. Yeah, you can take high quality supplements. I think that's fine with me. I personally don't do that because I find that I get it from my diet and don't have issues. But I think it's great if people want to supplement. Absolutely. So, yeah, again, the MCV being higher over 92 might suggest that B12, because what happens is when the red blood cells start to change in their morphology and the size get bigger and things like that, there's an indication of a need for B12 and folate because of how they're involved in the formation of the red blood cells. So just something not alarming. Don't have to run out and, freak out about this, but just something to, your tendencies. And this is why it's good to get labs, because you can look at your trends and then see if you change your life, your diet, your lifestyle, supplements, and then see over time what changes as a result of that. Okay. So let's look at your white blood cell count, because this again is another marker potentially of chronic inflammation. And so your WBC is at 4.3, which is on the lower side, which is great. And so when we think about inflammation, whether it's food sensitivities, food allergies, chronic inflammation, obesity, diabetes, we see the white blood cell count start to increase closer to 8 or 9. This is very common for a lot of folks, but yours is just 4.3, which is on the low side, which is good. One thing that I found quite interesting is looking at serum creatinine. So this is under your comprehensive metabolic panel here. Shadia, yours is at 0.76 milligrams per deciliter, so that's good. Creatinine can reflect our muscle mass, among other things, protein content in the diet. It's different from creatine. I know it sounds similar, but a lot of people sort of confuse the two, but yours at 0.76, I think that's good. I generally like to see this around 1, but that doesn't mean you need to do all this stuff to change your creatinine. But I will just say, like, in clients that I've worked with who have been vegan or vegetarian, this is often 0.5 or lower, which reflects like possible hints at sarcopenia. So your creatinine is looking good. Electrolytes and all that are right within the normal lab range, which is great. So I don't see a lot here that is really concerning. The reverse T3 was slightly higher than the midline of the range. Not terribly concerned about that. Sometimes when people are symptomatic, if they have issues with constipation, hair loss, being cold all the time, part of that could be that their thyroid is working normally, but that they are having some sort of life load and stress that is causing the reverse T3 to rise. So that's just something that I would pay attention to, but nothing alarming. How would you say your stress level is?
I think it's definitely high, but I do exercise a lot, so I feel like I can offset that with the amount of exercise I do, as well as getting sunlight and just, yeah, I think having community is also a big part of it all.
Yes, that's huge. Near reverse T3, don't want to gloss over or shift gears too much, but was your vitamin D at 48 nanograms per ml, which is great. During COVID and during the winter months, Shadia, you might want to bump that up just a hair. I mean, most research shows the ideal level of vitamin D would be around 65 milligrams, or sorry, nanograms per ml. Out of curiosity, are you supplementing with D3 or were you leading up to this?
No, I was not.
Yeah. Okay. So this is just you living your life, being intentional about sun exposure.
There's definitely supplementation for other things, but not for vitamin D, no.
Yeah. Great.
And I
Well, I
was
mean,
getting,
just
sun, I would say about 30 minutes a day, an hour a day.
nice. That's awesome. Well, that's reflecting your relatively high level of vitamin D. As I mentioned, if you wanted to optimize during the winter, I mean, you could supplement with 6,000 IUs and get that up closer to 60 if you wanted. I don't think that may or may not impact your seasonal cold and flu severity and things like that. But yeah, it's great to see that being intentional about being in the sun. A lot of people don't realize that if they're not getting at least 20 minutes of full body sun exposure, that they're probably going to be insufficient in vitamin D. So yeah, you're doing great there.
Is there anything, is there any possibility that too much supplementation of vitamin D can cause anything? Because I know people concerned about too much vitamin D supplementation, and I want to know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. So we'll go back up to page 1 and look at your comprehensive metabolic panel here. What we see, Shadia, is when people are supplementing too much with vitamin D, is you get elevated calcium in the blood. And so usually the calcium starts to bump up over 10 milligrams per deciliter. And in your case, it's 9.4. So that's generally what you see is this hypercalcemia. And that honestly might be a problem because we know that calcium is involved, should be shuttled to bone and things like that for the hard tissues, but you don't want calcium, say, in your coronary arteries or carotid arteries or in your brain. And so there can be issues there, but honestly, this is just anecdotal, but I have not seen that very often. Even in people who have vitamin D levels quite high for treatment or remission of multiple sclerosis. When I lived in Colorado, there's a lot of multiple sclerosis and Lyme disease and things like that. And people found benefit when they get their vitamin D levels up closer to 100 milligrams or 100 nanograms per ml. And so you would see calcium levels bump up a little bit, but definitely not seeing that with you. Since we're near calcium, it's worth noting your albumin was 4.7. This can be characterized as an ominous marker. When albumin starts to drop, especially suddenly, and cholesterol is quite low, that can be a little bit concerning, but we don't see that in this case. So that's another thing that I like to look at. But that was fine. since we're also here, your bilirubin. And so this is another biomarker that is related to um, obviously bilirubin metabolism, but this it's called glucuronidation, which is how bilirubin is metabolized in your liver and other tissues in the body. Sometimes we see that quite high in people who have a phenomenon known as Gilbert's syndrome, and you don't have that. And that just means that they have a sluggish glucuronidation pathway. But it's not just bilirubin that is funneled through this detox mechanism known as glucuronidation. There's other environmental chemicals, pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, et cetera, that pass through glucuronidation, that are eliminated from our body by way of glucuronidation. And with your bilirubin at 0.5, not concerned about that. But I do have friends and family who have bilirubins over 2, and they're concerned about that. And it means that they should probably support detox, go in the sauna, supplement with N-acetylcysteine, et cetera. But yours at 0.5, not concerned at all. So in conclusion, everything looks pretty good.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
Yeah, awesome. I know we went through that fast. Is there any questions that you have, or?
Yes, so I think one of the main questions is, so knowing I have this blood work, right? But I also know that there's other things happening like adenomyosis, endometriosis beginning stages, and osteopenia, surprisingly, but it's present. I got a DEXA scan done about 3 months ago. And that was there. So how are all of those things connected? In first question would be, how are all of those things connected? But also, how do I see that represented in the blood work as well? Because obviously we see the blood work and I don't see anything that signals that kind of, but maybe it's just not enough testing.
Yeah, Shadia, it's a really good question. And I honestly don't know the answers to that. I think, looking maybe more at hormones and possibly the detox, a more deeper dive into some of those aspects. But, from a metabolic health standpoint, to kind of rule out, could any insulin resistance be contributing to this dis-ease? My thoughts are probably not. And so then we got to look at other aspects of it, and try to rule out what could be going on and why. And I think possibly looking at the hormones, seeing if that could be skewed, the environmental chemical position, things like that, I think would be a better way to another next step, another next level to see what's going on.
So it's also, I think, great to bring awareness to that, because a lot of people would think that just blood work is enough. And even though it's such a great resource, it might not be the whole, it won't read the full spectrum of what's happening in your body. So
Totally.
yeah, thank you for sharing.
Yeah, it's so complex. I mean, that's the thing. So yeah, blood work is great. It's a nice first step, but there's many other tools, that we could look at. And that's kind of the shortcoming of mainstream medicine, is this is basically their main toolbox, right, to look at. And a lot of people do feel something is off, but their blood work might be totally fine. Or there could be a few biomarkers that were high, and the mainstream medical doctor doesn't know where to look. And so, yeah, working with a functional doc who's really good with OBGYN related therapies from a natural perspective would probably be, and that's not an area that I specialize in, but probably be the best next step in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. And one last question. I'm looking at this blood work that obviously has a lot of different markers, but then I see some clients or other people, maybe family members as well, that they go to the Western medicine doctor and they have a more traditional Western medicine approach to blood work. So I'd love if you could share a little bit of what the differences are when it comes to blood work from a functional medicine perspective, and also a Western medicine perspective, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a really great question. Well, I think there's a few different things that are different. Is oftentimes when someone gets their labs, biomarkers are considered in isolation. For example, if we just look very simply at your glucose, or hemoglobin A1C, if one biomarker is off, there's not a lot of consideration of the constellation of related biomarkers that would also indicate that one biomarker being either increased or decreased is a problem. So I think that's a thing that we often see. And then secondarily, and equally important, is the reference range. You know, when we look, just for example, Shadia, at your vitamin D, now it seems great, right? But it's midline of the lab range or what have you. But again, not considering your unique unmet needs or desires. Let's say you traveled a lot and you were prone to getting COVID or the flu in the wintertime. You know, a practitioner might, instead of just saying, well, your vitamin D is the midline of the range, it's fine. You know, there's research to show that around 65 nanograms per ml is ideal, you know, for preventing, you know, seasonal colds and flus and reducing severity of COVID, for example. And so I think that there's that two aspect of it is, instead of just looking at one biomarker in isolation, which a good example of this would be the liver enzyme that we talked about, GGT. We talked about glutathione and how it's related to liver fat buildup. You know, a lot of doctors don't even run that because they'll ask you, hey, Shadia, do you drink alcohol? Are you an alcoholic? And you'll be like, no, occasionally I have some wine or whatever, right? They will often not even run GGT because they've been trained that high GGT, or we only look at GGT if there is suspicion of alcoholism. But we now know that this liver enzyme is involved in much more than just, you know, a reflection of one's exposure to alcohol. It reflects, you know, fat buildup in the liver and also detoxification, glutathione, metabolism. So these are just things that I think the challenge here, doctors have their best intentions, nurse practitioners, physician's assistant, you know, they go to school because they want to help people, but they're constrained by insurance reimbursement and Medicare and time and all that. And so they're just, you know, doing the best they can with a short amount of time. And, you know, doing this review, which was pretty, you know, rudimentary, to be honest. I mean, it was more comprehensive than what most people might normally see, but we're just doing this in 30, 40 minutes. It takes a little bit of time to go through these things and then also make the appropriate recommendations. You know, change your diet, change your exercise. Well, what about your cosmetics? And all of these things take a little bit more time. And I think that's where, unfortunately, just how the model is set up for, you know, mainstream medicine, there's just not that time availability.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
Unfortunately, that is the case, but
yeah.
Thank you so much. This has been absolutely amazing.
For sure. Yeah. Thank you for, you know, being open to making your labs public. I don't have your birth date or anything like anything like that in there.
Okay, that's
Just
good
the
to know.
labs. I'll anonymize that.
Yeah,
Cool,
I think this
Shadia.
is really important to have somebody with a maybe normal looking blood work in some ways to have the opportunity to share and go over everything in detail. I think that was absolutely